Greetings, family. I'm excited today to present to you from New Faith Church and the Houston Metropolitan Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta, partnering together on this whole idea of hope for the holidays, a conversation centered around grief, domestic violence, and mental health during this holiday season. With so much going on in our world in 2020 and all of the challenges presented through COVID-19, I think this is a very important and poignant conversation that I think not only the world should have, but the church should have. And I'm excited to have three individuals who are experts in their field to talk about this particular subject. In the person first of Katrina Landry, I'm excited to have her, and I'd like for her to introduce herself if she will.
Well, hi. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for having me. I appreciate it. My name is Katrina Landry. I'm the owner of Renewed Hope Counseling Center. I work with adults and couples, and this is something that we definitely need to have, especially during this time, whether it's 2020 or the holidays. So I appreciate you for allowing us to be here.
Thank you, Katrina. We also have Carletta Nance.
Hello, everybody. I'm Carletta Nance. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I'm also a member of the Houston Metropolitan Alumnae Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And I'm just grateful to be here. I'm honored to be here. And I'm thankful for the collaboration of HMAC and New Faith Church. And I think it's very important that we talk about mental health because it's something that affects everybody.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Carletta. And now we also have Dana Burns. Dana Burns, thank you.
Hello, Dr. Lewis. Yes, I'm Dana Burns. I'm also a licensed professional counselor in private practice, Burns Counseling Group. And we're here to talk about everything that is affecting our community right now and mental illness being on the rise. This is an awesome opportunity and time to have this discussion because, like you said, in addition to COVID-19, we're going into the holidays. And so we want to thank you and our president, Kendra Lacey. Also, our first vice president is a member of your church, Tracy Fletcher. And so we are happy and grateful to be able to be here to share this time with you.
Wonderful. We're excited to have all three of you ladies. We look forward to having a wonderful conversation and dialogue centered around this whole idea of mental health and so on through the holiday season. At this time, we have a presentation from Katrina Landry on grief through the holidays.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to talk to you about grief. I'm going to go over a couple of things. One is kind of what is grief? What does it entitle? And so one of the things when we talk about grief is that it's a loss or a change in, it's a conflictual change in a loss of either a relationship or behavior. And to make it a little bit more simple, it's basically saying, hey, sometimes I struggle with how I'm feeling about a particular loss. And that could mean a conflictual feeling could be, I'm sad that I lost my grandparent, but I also understand that they're in a better space or they're no longer hurting. So there's some conflictual feelings that we have when we deal with grief. Loss can be a loss of a person, place, or thing. So things that bring meaning to you as well. So there are some experiences of loss that can produce grief, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's a few that I think that I'm going to kind of throw off the cuff that we don't necessarily think about. One, we think about divorce is one that is considered a loss, and then we have the normal ones where we feel like it's a loss of a person. However, there's also the loss of a pet. There's a loss of, sometimes people view grief when getting married because they lose a loss of independence. And so now I'm having to change, again, the loss of my lifestyle, the things that I do. And so that can also consider some type of grief. When we think of major health issues, that's a loss of changing of our lifestyles. Health conditions can also be one. But I think this year, especially, we've experienced the loss of our normalcy. And so we've had a significant loss in regards to normalcy of attending graduations or baby showers or weddings or even being together for the holidays. And so we are really feeling that type of, hey, we're changing. We're having some conflictual feelings of, yeah, I want to be safe, but I'm missing the longing of our normalcy and being together and enjoying one another. So that's things to consider when we're talking about grief. What does grief look like and what does it feel like? I often use grief in the analogy of water. One, because I like water, and two, because it's very applicable. So we will experience grief in what we may have waves. They may be softer waves where we have a passing thought of someone and we're feeling sad, and they can also feel like tsunamis. They are the ones where I want to be under a rock and put another rock on top of me. And so one of the things to be mindful of when we think about what grief looks like is that it's different for everyone. No matter what type of grief we have, again, even if we have something that's a similar type of grief, we experience grief differently. And so someone may experience it more with sadness, some may experience it more with withdrawal, some may experience it more with anger. And so just being mindful that your grief can be experienced differently. When we're looking at the different kinds of grief, like what would it look like? Sometimes it's seen in forgetfulness, having difficulty concentrating, and you can have change in appetite, but moods also change. So being mindful of that. The difference between sadness and anger. Sadness looks like we again have, we may have insomnia. We may have some struggles with either more sleep or less sleep. We have changes in weight that happens. And then we also have those spells of crying. We even may have some suicidal thoughts, maybe thoughts that we may want to be with that person that we've lost, or that life is harder now with this person not being here. And so again, those are all common things that may happen when we're experiencing grief. When we look at anger, sometimes anger can come out as maybe we're more irritable with people. We may come out as being more agitation in interactions with others. We may even be fighting, maybe not physically, but argumentatively. We may find those things. So just be mindful when you know someone's experiencing grief to see if you start to see some of those changes, because we want to give grace for those, but also understand that that's part of the process. When I want to talk about a little bit about the difference between normal signs of grief and then the clinical depression type of grief. So normal signs of grief are when we're looking at, you're still able to work. You have moments of sadness. They could be for parts of the day, but we also can experience happiness in different parts of the day as well. Again, we may have the suicidal thoughts, but they're passing. They're less likely to be something that you are seeking out or looking for ways to be able to do that. You are still able to be interactive with others, and you're still able to concentrate and complete tasks. When we're looking at signs of clinical depression, that's going to be more when we're looking at people are having much more difficulty leaving the house or doing daily routines of getting up out of the bed. And we're looking at suicidal thoughts, even actually having plans to carry those out. We're looking at difficulty in concentrating, and there's sadness, there's crying, and these are not just the random times that they happen. These are times when they are most days and most all day. That's what changes it from being what we think of just the sadness that we have that normally comes with grief versus the clinical depression. So just because someone is sad and they're crying and it comes out of what we feel like comes out of nowhere doesn't necessarily mean that they're clinically depressed because of grief. Allow that space for them to feel those particular things. So here's some ways that we can try to cope with grief during the holiday. One is find some ways to honor the person that you've lost. Yeah. If there's someone that I know, some clients, like one of mine likes, one of their parents likes a particular flower. So during the holidays, they would do that. Or maybe if there's a particular dish that you and your parent or someone, your loved one cooked, could you still do that in their honor? So find ways to honor that person. The other thing is, it's okay to say no. It's okay to say no. You're not okay to go to some of the holiday functions. It's okay to say no. I'm not as interactive as I used to be. It's okay to say no. It's not okay to always say no. So again, this is where we want to have that balance of know yourself, allow yourself the space to feel, but also don't completely isolate yourself so that you are not interactive at all. So, but know that it may be a lot to be around a lot of people during the holidays. So you may want to do it in smaller increments. Plan ahead, plan and see, if you're able to go for a little bit or what's comfortable for you, what things are going to be triggers for you that may spark some things that may be difficult. Have some support system around you. And so that's going to be really important too. So that kind of goes into, what does your support system look like? One of the things is, what do you need and who can do it? So if you need someone who's going to listen Do you need someone who's going to laugh with you? Do you need someone who's going to just sit there with you? Do you need someone who allows you to feel, but then also keeps you from staying and being consumed in that space? Who is that person that can do that for you? I talk with clients a lot about, especially at work, that who do we have as buffers? Who do we have that's a safe space for us that we can say, hey, maybe I'm having a red day today. My red day may be, it's not a good day. I'm hypersensitive today. And so that person can kind of be our buffer around everyone else at work or even within our home. Do they need to take phone calls for us for a while so that it protects our space? And so who do you have as a buffer? So know what you need for support as you're learning yourself through grief, and then who can you have to do that? For those of us who are helping others with grief, here are some really important things to think about. One, just be there. Sometimes people just need someone to sit there with them. It's not about rushing the emotion. It's not about how long this is going to take. Just be there with them. Also be mindful that you don't have to ask, well, how can I help? Find some ways to do that. And then here's one key point. Don't forget about them. Don't forget about people who have had grief, and once the funeral is over and everyone's went on about their life, don't forget about them because they're still struggling with that loss. Check in on them, see what they need, offer things, and then don't take it personal if you feel like they're saying no, thank you, or if you feel rejected. It's not really about you, and it's not in their intentions to do that. So I'm also going to leave some resources because I think those are going to be important too. There's a book called It's Okay If You're Not Okay. That's a really good resource that I think that we can have. And then also there's a mourner's bill of rights. And those are things that say, hey, as a person who's grieving, I have the right to these particular things. And sometimes we have to allow ourselves those rights first, that we can say, hey, it's okay for me to feel that way. And then we could just show others what we need while we're grieving. So hopefully these things were helpful for you, and during the holidays that you have a good support system and know it's okay to not be okay.
Katrina, I have a question for you, and it's pertaining to this whole idea of grief through the holidays. One of the questions that I have that I think that individuals would want to know is this whole idea: how will I know I have completed the stages of grief?
Well, that's very interesting. I, as a licensed counselor, kind of look at grief a little differently. Normally we hear the stages of grief of being either shock or denial. We may have some bargaining that we may have, and then we have anger, and then depression, and then we have acceptance. And one of the things that I think about is that grief is more of a journey. When we think of stages of grief, we think that it's one of these things where I can meet these particular areas and then I'm okay. And we may experience all of those stages in one day. And so it's important to know that we will have an influx of feelings throughout dealing with grief, and that it's not necessarily stages, but it's more of a journey.
Okay. Wonderful. Another question: how will I know grief is over?
That's a great question. One of the things about grief is that it's really not over. It's a journey. And one of the things is that we just learn to manage it differently. And so this loss that we've experienced will forever be there. And so the part of grief will still be there. We may randomly at times have the feelings of loss, or we may randomly have times of thinking about that loss. So the grief part doesn't necessarily go away, but how we manage it and the intensity of it does.
Okay. So as a person who's struggling with grief or challenged with grief, and kind of knowing, that it's an ongoing process, are there any recommendations that you would give that a person could possibly do or don't do in terms of dealing with grief?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things, so I'll speak from two different perspectives. One is for someone who is dealing with grief is know yourself. Allow yourself the space. I think in our culture in general, we can kind of struggle with allowing ourselves to emote and to feel things. And so that's a struggle. And so I allow ourselves that space. It's okay to cry. We will experience, again, a lot of different emotions. And so having that space, creating a support system is very, very important. Who do you have that can be helpful for you? Who do you have that can laugh with you, or who can help you kind of pull out of that space so it's not consuming? So having that support system. For someone who is helping others deal with grief, some don'ts.
Okay.
Don't say it's going to be okay.
Wow.
Don't change the subject.
Wow.
Don't be uncomfortable with their grief. Don't diminish their grief. And so sometimes we just need to be present, just be there. And we're not, and don't say, I know how you feel.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, even if we've experienced the same type of loss, like you lost a spouse, I lost a spouse, it still doesn't mean that you know how I feel. And so allow that person to have that space, but be mindful that we can have an understanding, but we still don't really know.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I think that was a great presentation. I really believe some of our viewers were really helped. I know I was helped. Next up, we have Carletta Nance, who's going to talk to us about domestic violence during the holiday.
Self-isolation during the coronavirus pandemic can be real stressful for a lot of people.
That's right. Now there's growing concern for domestic violence victims who may be actually stuck inside a home with their abuser. Channel 2's Robert Arnold continues our live team coverage tonight with a closer look at that. Robert, good evening.
Police, prosecutors, and victim advocates all say domestic violence victims are in a particularly vulnerable state right now because so many are trapped with their abusers due to stay-at-home orders.
We're concerned that people will not be able to access the phones to call us.
Emily Whitehurst is the CEO of the Houston Area Women's Center.
We're concerned that people, when they normally are able to go out and be seen and access their social networks for support, won't be able to do so.
Whitehurst says even if a person is trapped with their abuser, there are some measures that can be taken. Keep your phone charged so that if you get a chance to call for help, you can. Make sure you have all vital documents together so you can leave quickly. Keep track of where your abuser keeps weapons. If things do escalate, get to a room with an easy exit and give your kids a code word that when you use that word, they know to dial 911.
So that pressure cooker kind of situation is what we're seeing a whole lot more of.
Montgomery County Prosecutor Echo Hudson is talking about cases where the stress of isolation, unemployment, and illness is leading to violence. Hudson says the office has actually seen a 35% increase in domestic violence cases over this time last year, both so-called pressure cooker cases and those with a history of violence.
The dramatic increase has been very scary.
Whitehurst says rising unemployment can further trap a victim who is financially dependent on their attacker. Nonetheless, she says help is always available, even with the pandemic, keeping many people behind closed doors.
And that's what we worry about, that this isolation can escalate and compound the violence.
Fort Bend County prosecutors say they have seen a 25% increase in these cases from this time last month and a 50% increase from this time last year. Houston Police Chief Art Acevedo says his department's also seen an increase in these calls. However, HPD has yet to release any official numbers. Officials with the Harris County DA's office say they have not seen an increase overall. Galveston prosecutors say their numbers remain consistent with the same numbers this time last year. And officials with the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services say there's actually been a slight decrease in the number of calls to the statewide abuse hotline. However, in these cases, the concern is with so many domestic violence victims being trapped with their accusers, they can't call for help and they are not leaving the house. Therefore, there are not all these extra eyes on a person who can in turn make that call for help on their behalf. Reporting live from downtown, Robert Arnold, KPRC, Channel 2 News.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay, so what I want us to understand too is domestic violence is something that is not always just physical, right? That's the first thing we kind of think about when we hear domestic violence. We think automatically physical, but honestly, it is a host of other behaviors that really deal with power and control. So it can deal with manipulation, it can deal with harassment, it can deal with stalking, name calling, psychological abuse, stealing your car keys, stealing your wallet, controlling your funds, humiliation. All of those things are abuse. And it's interesting because I used to work with the offenders. A lot of time there is a lot of support for the victims, as there should be, right? But I worked with the offenders. I worked with the guys or women who were charged with assaultive offenses. And the first thing they would say is, well, you know, I'm here because of the courts, but I've never put my hands on a woman. And I would always challenge them to understand, you're saying that as if that's like a badge of honor, or that's even better than other types of abuse. And so we talk about in those classes for the offender accountability and how there is a host of behaviors, again, like I just listed, that you are doing as abuse. It's also making you more self-aware of your toxic behaviors. And I think that's something that we all have to understand, is that some of our behaviors are very toxic, which then end up leading into abuse. And then again, it really turns physical towards the end. Most relationships don't even start out as physical. Some do, but most, it starts out with, again, the humiliation, the manipulative behavior, the power and control. Okay. So in my professional experience, I think that verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse are the worst types of abuse. You know, some people have said, some of my clients have said to me that they would rather take the beating or the violence over what was said to them or the humiliation that they went through. Also, you know, essentially bruises, wounds, they all heal. But you never forget how somebody made you feel. You never forget what they said to you. I know people who are adults, 50s, and they still remember what was said to them as children. They still remember what was said to them in their marriage. They've never forgotten any of those things. And it's triggering. It's something they never forgotten. So also keeping in mind that we have to be mindful of what we say. I think, when we get older, we're like, well, I didn't mean to say that. I said that whenever I was upset. But I think as we get older, we have to be more accountable of what's coming out of our mouth. We have to also be mindful that sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say. Mm-hmm. And very language like you language, or always blaming, always playing the victim, again, that takes us back to that toxic behavior. Okay? So the other thing is that domestic violence, it affects generations. So I think one way we can look at it is, how did I get in this relationship, or how did I get like this? I think we have to look at the beginning. Look at how this started. Where did you learn this behavior? Where did you learn it was okay to put your hands on somebody? Where did you learn, Queen, where did you learn that it was okay to stay in a relationship with someone who disrespects you, dishonors you, puts their hands on you, and to stay there? So I think we have to take a look at the beginning, and ultimately it affects the kids the worst. So as an adult in an abusive relationship, right, we are trained, we're a little bit more mature not mature, but we are trained to be able to get through things. We have the tools, we're older, we've been through some things, we have some wisdom, we can get through some things, and we're able to express ourselves appropriately, or we know how to articulate what's going on in our feelings sometimes. But kids, think about it. They don't really know what's going on. They don't even know how to sometimes put those feelings into words, right? And some of the things that they have seen, the damage that's done to them is irreversible. So many times I hear clients saying, well, I stayed because, I just didn't want my family to be broken up, or I just didn't want my husband to not be in my children's life. I grew up without a father, so I didn't want my kids to not grow up without a father. What we don't realize is the damage is done most to the kids, mm-hmm. and it's irreversible. So the National Coalition states, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence says, kids that have witnessed between their parents or guardians have witnessed violence is the strongest risk factor that transmit violent behavior from one generation to the other. So they have witnessed it as kids, and this is how the cycle starts beginning or cycling out of control or starting. This is how the cycle starts. And so boys are twice as likely to abuse their own partners and children. Twice as likely. When they have witnessed it growing up, they are twice as likely to abuse their partners or children. With girls, they're most likely to suffer from mental health issues, to get involved with drugs and alcohol. They also have issues with social skills. And they also end up getting in relationships where they are in abusive relationships. So they end up getting with someone exactly of what they seen when they were growing up. Think about the message that we are sending to our children. Okay, we're teaching our girls, this is how a man's supposed to behave in your life, and this is how you act in his presence. You know, for our young boys, they end up sometimes being exactly what they said they weren't. They end up being just like dad when they hated it. Sometimes they were the ones who got in the way and were trying to protect mom. So again, I just need us to understand that it affects generations. A lot of times whenever I get clients in and they're talking about what happened in their families or domestic violence, I got to go back to the childhood because it's all connected. And here's the other thing that we don't realize, and I think I learned this early on. Even affects as easy as little as 11-month-old or babies in the womb. Okay, because 11-month-old who's in the arms of their mother while they're being attacked, they constantly keep having, you know, screaming, waking up screaming. Also, too, when the mother leaves the room, they're constantly screaming. And again, they are traumatized just even at 11 months. In the womb, you can feel it. It's been reported that they crunch up when they hear, their heart rate goes up too when they hear a lot of screaming and crying and when the mother is emotionally upset. So we think that sometimes our kids don't see it, they don't hear it, we try to close the door. But again, kids pick up on everything. Kids are almost sometimes Xerox copies of their parents. This is a learned behavior. So they truly understand and they watch everything they want to do. They watch everything parents do. Most boys want to be just like their dads. Most girls want to be just like their moms. You know, their daddy's girls. You know, sons love their mama. So again, it affects the kids, and we really have to keep in mind of that. Also, kids understand their parents are the first examples of what love looks like. You know, as they start dating and become teenagers or even just adolescents, even just young, what they seen growing up. So if they didn't see it or if they did see it, and if it was abusive, this is what they learned. This is what they understand of what love is. And as we go into our clips, you'll understand why people have stayed, because again, this is what they seen. They didn't know any different. And what us parents have to keep in mind is we expose our children to this type of violence or abuse, right? And then we don't have the conversation. We have no conversation of what exactly is going on, you know, what happened when dad's leaving, what's going on. We just kind of say, we're trying to protect them, right? We're trying to, they're not ready for that, or they're not going to understand, or I just don't know how. A lot of parents don't know how to have these conversations, but we have to. Because that small part of having the conversation and essentially getting them some help can break the cycle. That is what we need to do. We really want to break this cycle because, again, it affects generations. So I want us to kind of go into pretty much how the cycle of how it happens in a relationship. So the cycle of how it happens in a relationship, and essentially you might get someone who's charming. And let me just be clear. Men can also be affected by domestic violence. So this is not just solely to women. Men can, and I actually had an opportunity to counsel a man who wasn't with me long, but he was a battered man. And the way it happened with him is power and control. You know, the woman that he was with, his partner, went on his job and caused him to actually lose his job, which then his financial situation was pretty much, he was on unemployment, and she collected the check, so she was in charge of everything. I mean, he had a tracking on his phone. He was pretty much intimidated her children, her adult children intimidated him and pretty much threatened him. So that was a way that she was able to kind of keep him together, power and control. So going back into the cycle of how it starts, the honeymoon phase, they're very charming. They want to win everybody over. They're saying, you know, sending flowers, cards, bringing you gifts every time you see them, you know, very charming, but also very manipulative. Keep in mind of that part, very manipulative. So even to their homeboys sometimes, they're always kind of talking about they're the victim, what the woman does. Never really takes accountability of any of their behavior, right? And so the victim sometimes sees these red flags early on, but wants to believe that, this is the way he loves her. So initially he might be calling you all the time, might be always checking on you, text messages, very angry whenever you're not responding fast enough. Again, he wants you to spend all his time with you. So he essentially wants you to be his world, and you do not really have a life outside of him. Okay. And then you start to, after the honeymoon phase, you really have probably seen him get angry. And that's where I feel like you really start to get to know somebody in a relationship the first time you see them get angry, right? Mm-hmm. So the tension starts building, and that's the next cycle that we'll go into. And, the abuser is very edgy. Another way of intimidation is to completely shut down. So then what that does to the victim is like, I'm kind of walking on eggshells. I don't really want to say too much. And I start to really learn early on that I'm going to start just keeping the peace. So I'm going to say whatever I have to say to keep the peace. I don't want to upset him. And then also too, I'm not even realizing that is the way he's controlling me. So I'm not even able to be my true self. Mm-hmm. And think about that. Is that really love? Am I really in a loving, healthy relationship? We don't even think about that. Okay. So then, again, they try to keep the peace. And then the first violent outbreak phase. So there could be a major destructive act of violence, right? He could break something. He could grab you. He could throw you up against the wall. He could slam the door. Just little things. It might seem like it's little, but it is the first outbreak, is the first event, pretty much violent event that happens. And initially what happens is the victim blames herself. I should have never gotten upset. I knew better, it's all my fault. I'm always messing things up. And sometimes the victim will escape, but essentially they end up going back, and it becomes that cycle again. The abuser is, oh my goodness, I'm sorry. They are blowing your phone up. They're showing up to your house. They're calling you, texts, all of that, ultimately to get you back where they want you to. And that's okay. And so I'm giving you all these gifts, and then I'm showing you that I'm sorry. And then the next time we get in an argument, the same thing. Do you know it takes almost 35 times of violence before a victim actually leaves? That's what they've said. That's what researchers said, that it takes years before they actually leave. So that goes into my next segment, is just pretty much the most common response with domestic violence is people always wonder, why would you stay with someone who did this to you? And why would she stay? Typically they think that maybe she's not really being abused, or did he really hit her? I don't know if she's really being abused, because I can't see myself staying in that. Okay. And so typically I want us to understand that it's a survival tactic of why sometimes we stay. We're trying to stay for our kids. We're trying to not die, because we know sometimes that if I don't do what he says, he's threatened to kill me, and I believe he will. But I also think we have to understand that is not a time for us to go numb. I think sometimes the victims go numb. They just get through it. I think sometimes as family members, we don't really want to get involved, or we don't know what's going on, or we don't want our loved one to isolate us. We don't want, we just kind of try to stay neutral, but we know something's going on. And I'm a firm believer that if you see something, you got to say something. So there was a hashtag that was on Twitter and also on a lot of social media. It says, "Why I Stayed." And where a lot of victims are sharing why they stayed. And I want to read some of them will be on the screen. But one said, "Why I stayed. I tried to leave the house after an abusive episode, and he blocked me. He slept in front of the door the entire night." Why I stayed. I stayed because my pastor told me that God hates divorce. It didn't cross my mind that God hates abuse too. I had to plan an escape for months before I even had a place to go and money for the bus to get there. Why I stayed. I stayed because he said he was sorry, and I trusted that it meant it wouldn't happen again and again and again. So I just want us to realize sometimes that it's not always just so easy to leave. It's actually, that's the most difficult, that's the most really scariest time. But I do believe that when we leave and we start trusting ourselves, that, and also, so while we're in the church, we got to really start trusting God. I don't believe that is God's will for us to stay in relationships like that. I know old school is that we don't get divorced, but I think it's important for us to say now is that I don't think that's God's will to be in a relationship like that. And I think we have to start trusting ourselves, and that is where we allow God to give us everything that we don't have. And just going back to my last part, I am going to list some resources in Houston that you can, if you know anyone that's been affected by this, some resources that can help you, places you can go, support groups, all of those things, legal help, because again, finances. I was not the breadwinner. I stayed at home. That's what he wanted me to do. I stayed at home. I took care of the kids. It's not so easy to just leave. So I think I want us to all just understand that and just to be able to support somebody. The last thing is supporting someone who's going through this. So 5 steps to support somebody. They'll be on the screen, but it's also actively listening and not judging, right? A lot of times it's like, girl, you better get out of that. It's not that easy. So sometimes I just need your ear. I just need you to talk to me sometimes. Sometimes I'm not even going to mention it, but I'm calling you. I need to talk. I need you to answer, right? Saying, you know what? I'm so sorry this happened to you. This was not your fault. Because a lot of times the victim is going to blame themselves. Instead of pushing somebody to action, ask them how you can support them in their choices, because sometimes they're not ready to leave. They're not even ready to call the police. And times like this, it's all kind of difficult for us to want to call the police, as a result of what's going on in the world. But again, if they're not ready to call the police just yet, ask how you can support them in their choices. Educate yourself on available resources. Like I said, it will be on the screen in this segment. And then also helping them make a safety plan. In the video that initially played at the beginning, it listed some steps of, what you can do with your kids, and just as a victim, what you can do as some safety tips. But again, helping them make a safety plan as a way to minimize harm and risk is some good tips of how you can support a friend that's going through this. So.
Wonderful. Carletta, I'm really excited about the fact that you brought up the whole idea of domestic violence and some of the things that I think happen in church, because I think one of the challenges of church is that we don't talk about domestic violence enough. Mm-hmm. And many of us don't really understand some of the red flags that potentially are there in church in terms of domestic violence. So if you will, what are some of the red flags, issues that can indicate that a man or a woman could become abusive?
So thank you for asking that. So I think, again, it goes back to the isolation, the control. You may have never been at their house. Mm-hmm. They may have never even invited you over. I think also you've never really seen them away from each other. And again, marriage couples, they're really connected. They don't really go too much, outside anywhere outside of each other. But again, a woman, you see a couple in church and you've never seen her individually on her own. Or it can be, how many times they're calling, they're texting, and sometimes if you just pick up on the woman's nonverbal sometimes, or if she says something that's out of line, sometimes you can see just some red flags right in there of how he responds to her, or how she responds to them. The other thing is the submission thing, People are quick to use that, women should submit to their husbands, which that is in the Bible. People have twisted it to be, to make it apply and almost make it as a control thing when that's not what it was designed to be. Yeah. The other thing, again, is just, it goes back to power and control. So she has to ask permission to do everything. She has to ask permission to spend money, or he essentially doesn't want her I think in this season, he don't want her to go anywhere because of COVID. Oh, you don't need to go nowhere. Stay here in the house. Mm-hmm. So again, I think in the church, people are very private. So what they show in the church, they might put on this face of everything's great, but it's the little signs. It might be nonverbals. It might be how he responds to her, how she responds to him, the controlling, all of those things is a mixture.
It's a mixture.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Let me ask you another question. What can a person do who ultimately knows of a person who's dealing with a domestic violence situation? What are some things that they can do to help?
So going back to what I said, sometimes they are not ready to call the police, and we want our loved ones to automatically get into action. But one thing I think is good is for them to understand they're not alone. Okay. And so encouraging them or giving them some some resources or some support groups. The Houston Area Women's Center has a great support group that you can go to, and you really sometimes just knowing you're not alone and just hearing the stories of everybody else, sometimes you can put yourself in everybody's shoes in the room. Also, stay vigilant, stay connected to them. At any time they can make the decision that they're done. A lot of survivors have just said, you know what, I don't know what made me just, end it, but this is enough. And when that happens, they need support. They might need somewhere to stay. They might need a ride. They might need a lot of help. So if we know somebody, we have to stay connected to them, checking on them, being vigilant. I from personal reasons, I know that anytime I seen, a friend of mine or relationships and it was getting kind of heated and I knew what was going on, I stayed watching. And I think right now, as a neighbor, I've seen certain things just outside of my house. And I didn't want to call the police, but I did just keep watching. So sometimes it's just staying vigilant. Also, ultimately, if it gets bad, I think calling the police, because again, if you see something, saying something, that could be the life or death. It could be a life or death situation. Yeah.
I think one of the things that you mentioned that I think is important to kind of, dissect and talk about is the whole idea of the church's role and responsibility, especially when you talk about tradition of staying together in domestic situations. I think, the church has evolved very much. And I think from a theological perspective, the church talks about reconciliation a lot. And so people misinterpret reconciliation. In a domestic violence situation, we always talk reconciliation, but reconciliation could be separate and you going to get the help that you need.
Yes.
And so I think it's really important from a pastoral role that I help our members and those who are viewing to appreciate the idea that you can also reconcile in two separate homes and the other person's getting the help they need, especially with domestic violence.
I want to add one more thing to what you just said, because it just triggered me to say this. So a lot of times I need for us to understand that abuse is not going to stop unless someone gets help.
That's right.
Also, they also say when they stay in a relationship with that same partner and do not get the help, it may stop for a year, for 2 years, but ultimately it is a cycle. And that person, both parties need help if they plan to still stay in the relationship.
Absolutely. Carletta, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Next up, family, we have mental health during the holidays with Dana Burns.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I'm just sitting here loving the conversation. I forgot I was supposed to be presenting next. And I think this is the best place to be having this conversation.
Right.
Because when there's faith, sometimes there is stigma connected to the mental illness piece, because historically sometimes we've been told just pray about it or just talk to your pastor and go get some pastoral counsel. But sometimes there are things that are outside of the realm of what praying is a useful tool. I'm all for prayer, but being able to refer people that we care about to other services that are available for all types of mental illness. So the conversation is very much needed. And this is what this panel is here to do, to start the conversation in our homes, in our communities, and have honest conversations about mental illness. So just to conclude and wrap up, for all the good things that have been said, is that mental illness is on the rise for obvious reasons. The elephant in the room is COVID. And so this has always been a challenge for us, but it is on the increase because of everything that's going on in the world right now. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the top ones that we hear a lot about, which is anxiety, depression, which Katrina talked about a little bit, as well as suicide. It is outrageous, the rise in the number of people who are taking their own lives right now. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that, have some discussion, and talk also about the signs and symptoms, because usually there's always going to be some sign as to what's going on. And now that everything is slowed down, we're not so much in a place where we're doing everything else. So hopefully we can pay a little bit more attention to what's going on with people. So when we hear the word anxiety, I think if we're honest, we can admit that we all have some level of anxiety, worry, or nervousness, or unease, especially with everything that's going on. We don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know if we're going to be on a shutdown. We don't know if unemployment is going to run out. We don't know if we're going to get another stimulus check. All these things that are going on is creating some level of anxiety. But there's another level to that anxiety that if it's not managed well, it carries over into panic. So some people will start having panic attacks, and extreme discomfort and irrational fears. And so what we want to do is, and part of what I do is help clients make a plan and take charge of your brain. Oftentimes we don't realize we are in control of our thoughts. Our thoughts don't exist in and of themselves. We are in control of what we think, but because we don't slow those things down in the moment, we think, things just happen. I don't know how that happened. I don't know where those feelings are coming from. And so sometimes it's important to take a moment and write things down. What am I worried about? What are the things that are really causing me the most fear and concern? And what can I do about it? What are my options to help kind of settle some of that anxiety before it goes over into panic or over into depression, the clinical depression, what Katrina talked about. Right now, what a lot of people are dealing with is what some call situational depression. A lot is going on that is adding to feelings of sadness, hopelessness, constant worry, anxiety, stress, difficulty sleeping. And it's going from anxiety and it's compounded by depression because we don't know what's next. We're not able to do our normal activities and things that we would normally do. And so sometimes someone that's depressed, it may not be a grief situation, but someone is just constantly crying all the time and you don't know how to help and they don't know how to help themselves. That could be a sign of depression. And so lack of enjoyment of things that they were once able to do that they thought was fun. And so that's where it comes in for us to take a look at, I'm noticing that maybe my sister or my mom or my friend, the things that we used to talk on the phone for hours, now when I call, she doesn't answer the phone. And that in and of itself does not mean that someone is depressed. These are just some things to look for. And I want to just spend a little bit more time talking about the suicide piece because that's the thing that is really very, very much on the rise, and the paying attention part. So some signs and symptoms that we can look for if someone is potentially suicidal. Changes in mood or behavior. That's big. That's very important. And these things, like I said, alone does not mean that someone may harm themselves. But if you see a number of the things that you see on this slide, then that's something that you need to take notice about. A deep sense of hopelessness about the future. Right now, there's a lot of talk about the vaccine and all these things. And so you may start seeing most people are becoming more hopeful. Discussions about, do I take it? Do I not take it? But people are still having conversations about what's next. If you find someone that is, their mood has changed, they're not hopeful about the future, they don't have things to look forward to. Another thing, it could be just the opposite, a sudden calm. Someone who's been totally off the charts and now all of a sudden they are extremely calm, withdrawn, nothing seems to matter, they're isolating. These are things that we need to be mindful of. A recent trauma, a life crisis. Sometimes that might be a little hard to gauge because we're all going through some level of trauma, it may seem right now. But there are a lot of things that are still happening in the midst of COVID. People are still getting sick from other things. We're not able to memorialize people in the way that we once did. I talked to a young lady this morning. She suffered a miscarriage and she had a loss of a family member. So just the traumas of life that can go on drop down in the middle of this COVID world that we're living in. Also, someone might be very open about talking about wanting to die. I just don't want to be here anymore. We always think Well, do they have a plan? Someone may not have a full drawn out plan, which means they may not be in imminent danger. But if they're talking a lot about death, what would happen if I wasn't here? Those kind of conversations. Feeling trapped, like there are no solutions, or extreme guilt or shame about things that have happened. And also risky behaviors that would put them in a situation that could potentially cause death or lead to death. And giving away possessions. That's the classic. That's the one that we hear and we see people talk about all the time. Things that they once valued, that were important, that now are not as significant anymore. These are the things that we need to be mindful of. Another thing that I think is so important is we get fearful about having these direct conversations with people about what are some of your thoughts? What are some of your fears? What's going on? You seem a little different. Asking someone about suicide is not going to cause them to kill themselves. That is a big myth. We don't want to have the conversation because if I say something, then they might go out and do it. No, that's exactly what you want to do. You want to have the conversation with someone that you're concerned may harm themselves because it brings it out into the open. That's the reason why I'm so happy that we're having this conversation here, because we cover a lot of things.
Right.
And once they're out in the open, it challenges us to deal with it. Whatever it is, if I'm feeling a little overly anxious, or if I'm really, really sad and I can't come out of it, these are all conversations that we can have with our family members and friends that we care about. One of the things I want to wrap up with is there's another stigma around medication. Oftentimes, especially with our children in our school systems, parents don't want to medicate their children, or I don't want them labeled, or even as adults. The way I describe the choice for medication to my clients, it's not, no, everybody doesn't need medication. Somebody will hear this and will be able to take the tools that we have discussed and use them to decrease their anxiety and depression. Everybody is not going to be able to do that.
Right.
I have a high blood pressure pill that I take every day.
Right.
I get mad every time I have to take it because I want to be free of this. I'm believing that God is going to heal me from this blood pressure. But I take that medicine because I don't want to have a stroke and I want to live until God heals me from it. It's the same thing with any type of medication that we need that will reduce our level of anxiety or panic. Sometimes we need a little help.
Right.
And I believe that God uses the gifts that he gives us, whether it's to sing a song or play an instrument or to create these medications that help us so we can be better. It doesn't mean that you have to take something for the rest of your life. It may be a temporary situation to what is going on with your life right now. And so I try to educate my clients about medication is not a death sentence. It's not the end of the world. It may just be something that would be helpful right now. And so hopefully this information was helpful to start the conversation in your family. I'm an advocate for family meetings. Call everybody together.
Right.
How's it going? How you doing in this pandemic that we're living in? Have a conversation with your children, with your spouse, sisters, other siblings, aunts, uncles. You know, we're talking about not being able to come together for Thanksgiving and now Christmas. A lot of us are doing Zoom parties and just to stay connected. What if we had a conversation around mental illness on our Zoom meetings? How is everybody doing? Not just the fun stuff, not just the Zoom happy hours, but how are you feeling? Like, how are you really doing? And be the one that starts the conversation, because we like to talk on the surface. You know, oh, I'm doing fine. You know, blessed and highly favored. You know, all those things that we like to say. But what if you could be the one that starts the conversation and says, you know, I'm not doing too well. I'm struggling right now. I'm having a hard time getting out of bed. I don't know what the future looks like for me. Be the one to start the conversation.
Absolutely. So, Dana, let me ask you two questions.
Okay.
So if I have a family member and I'm under the impression that they may be having some mental health issues, what should I do? What are some things that I can do?
So again, like I just said, make sure you're having the conversation. Ask them, what's going on with you? Like you've already heard, how can I help? But first and foremost, recognizing the signs. That means we have to pay attention. And I cannot impress enough to reach out. When in doubt, reach out.
Okay.
If you don't know what to do, somebody knows what to do. I tell people all the time, the internet is a powerful tool.
Absolutely.
If you don't know who to talk to, Google it. We are available as a resource. I was so happy to hear that your church has a mental health team that is available not just to the church but to the community. So reach out, be supportive, be direct with the questions that we talked about. If someone is in a crisis, they are not to be left alone. If you recognize that someone is in a dangerous situation, don't leave them alone. And also, don't just give the instruction about, girl, you need to get you a therapist. I see a counselor, you need to get you one. I like to tell people, I'm a Christian, I love God, I am saved, I'm a therapist, but I have a therapist.
That's right.
But if someone is in a crisis, they may not be able to navigate that process. And so you might be the one that needs to say, let's sit down. Do you have insurance? You can call your provider. They can send you a list. Is this something you're going to be able to pay for? Do we need to find community resources? So helping someone navigate through that process.
Wonderful. Listen, I have one last question. So you did touch on it a little bit about this idea of what should be done in a crisis. If a crisis is currently happening, how should a family member address that crisis if it's happening in their presence?
So depending on the type of crisis, if it's a situation where someone needs to be hospitalized or they need some care that you cannot provide, if they are not in what we call imminent danger, which means immediately something horrible could potentially happen right now, harm to themselves or someone else, and you can get them to somewhere, Bentop Neuropsych Center or somewhere else that's a facility, then you want to take them somewhere that they can get some help. If that's not feasible, then call 911. If you're calling 911, you want to be clear that this is a mental health issue so they can send the right people to the scene. We see that all the time. People end up harmed because they send an officer or someone who is not trained to handle the situation that's going on. So call 911, give them the details, and let them know that you are concerned that this is a mental health issue so the person that's coming to the scene can be prepared to handle what's going on.
Okay, wonderful. Well, listen, ladies, I have been quite helped today. I really believe that our audience, our viewing audience, has been helped also. I think this whole idea centered around grief through the holidays with Katrina Landry, and then domestic violence during the holidays with Carletta Nance, and then finally mental health during the holidays with Dana Burns has been a help, tremendous help to our community, to the District K area, and even to our family members and friends. Let me just add one quick caveat. I think it's important that individuals get the mental health counseling that they need. I think that they need to sit with a counselor, but I also think from a biblical perspective, you need to sit and spend some time with God. I think it's really important when I think about Exodus chapter 3, when Moses was dealing with the children of Israel as they were fleeing from Pharaoh. They were under a lot of crises. They were under a lot of mental health issues and challenges. Being under a Pharaoh for over 400 years, being mistreated, it was a lot they had to deal with. But in turn, Moses went to God, and after going to God as his leader, the Bible says that Moses comes down and says literally that God hears your affliction and he heard your cry. And I think the most important thing that we have is to know that God hears us. The Bible teaches us over and over again that God is present with us. He's an ever-present help. And so my prayer during this season, during this holiday season, that you not only get the mental health that you need or help that you need, but you definitely call and talk to God. My prayer is that each of you were helped. I thank you, ladies, again for all that you did. I pray that God continues to watch over each and every one of you, and that you guys have a tremendous Christmas break, and that you remember Jesus is still the season or the reason for the season. Have a blessed day.
Thank you.
Thank you.